Hello, my name is David Delgado Vendrell. I am an architect and BIM consultant. I run the company DDB near Barcelona in the south of Europe. I am collaborating in several educational programs as a BIM lecturer. I am the Vice President within the design area in our national chapter, buildingSMART Spain. And I'm also part of the board of GUBINCAT, the BIM Users Group of Catalonia, and I am also representing buildingSMART Spain in the Catalonia's commission to implement BIM at a regional level. Today I'm gonna show you how to get the most out of this BIM authoring tool called Graphics of ArchiCAD when we have as a goal the delivery of information models based in the IFC schema. So the goal of this presentation is to highlight some tips and tricks using Graphics of ArchiCAD to exchange information based on this type of information models. The workflow that we are currently using when we are producing this type of information models is the called reference models, in which we first of all we define in our BIM execution plan different BIM uses, right? And each of those uses establish the goal of our information model production, which in this case will be made from Graphics of ArchiCAD. So we will use the reference model strategy to create those models. We will transfer that data to other stakeholders, and depending on which is our quality management framework, we could also use the standard BCF for the issue tracking and finishing this cycle requesting for a change to the authors of those models. So this is the typical reference model within the OpenBIM framework. So in ArchiCAD we have what we call translators. When we start preparing our activity, our production activity, we configure our templates, and we have two types of translators for import and export. We have some predefined ones coming from different BIM authoring environments, but we can also create our own customized ones in which we can define which version of the schema, the model view definition that we want to use, and we can also customize our own model view definition, defining different settings, as we will see during the next slides. One of the first things that we need to take into account when we are exchanging information based on a file-based exchange is the name of our files, right? So we will probably have our required protocols, some of them standard ones, some others company-based ones. No matter which is that naming convention protocol, we can in ArchiCAD apply it using a quite useful and interesting feature which is called Publisher, in which we can proceed creating a batch publication. So which means that especially it's quite useful with large deliverable packages. You can create previously your file set, establishing the different naming convention rules, and you can create the name of your files before exporting them. Another quite interesting feature is the IFC preview feature, which in ArchiCAD is called IFC Project Manager. So, which means that you can save a lot of time because you are able to see how your IFC model will look before exporting it. And as you probably know, some of the IFC export times are quite large, depending on several reasons, but usually are quite long. So, which means that it will save us a lot of time in our production activity. Another important step when we are creating and exchanging information based on in IFC, it's about the location of our modeled objects, right? And in this case, probably a building. What we suggest within ArchiCAD, as others are doing, is to create an object. So we need a shape representation of a particular object. We usually use a cube, but you could also use an inverted pyramid, and place it at the project origin. Also, we suggest you to classify it as a geospatial element, and also you can use a more granular way of identifying that object in the IFC schema, which is establishing user-defined as one of the enumeration options in the predefined attribute, and also then establishing the object type value as, for example, a geospatial control point. This is a quite good way to define that object. Another important object, in this case it's an object coming from the ArchiCAD library, it's called the survey point. This object will export the coordinates, the customized ones, depending on if you are geo-referencing or establishing some other customized coordinates within your model. You will be able to export that data in your IFC. So you should know that in order to do that, you have to define in your export translator this feature called ArchiCAD survey point position. Which means that then you will export your model using also this survey point object. Another important part when we, especially at the very beginning of our modeling activity, it's defining the stories, the different levels of our building, right? So it's quite important that when we are establishing the names of each of those stories, ultimately what we are doing is defining the value of an important attribute of this class IFC building story. So, which means that depending on which are our information requirements in our BIM execution plan, we will have to deliver our models defining the name of those levels. And when we are doing it within graphics of ArchiCAD, what we are doing is establishing the name of our IFC building story. This is quite important. And here, just as an additional information, please take a look on this interesting discussion within the forums of buildingSMART International, in which there is a quite deep and interesting discussion about this attribute, the attribute elevation, IFC building story. So please take a look. Also here, and for me, this is one of the most important, one of the parts in which any modeler or technician that is producing IFC files from IFC ArchiCAD should take care the most, is about BIM classification systems. BIM classification systems in ArchiCAD are the core or the key stone when especially we are creating IFC models. In this case, you should know that you can import several international standardized BIM classification systems using XML files that are stored in a Graphisoft web portal. You can import them within the Graphisoft ArchiCAD, and then you can proceed to multi-classify your objects. So, which means that we can use each of those classification systems as the key of different scenarios that are aligned to our different BIM uses. And remember that in our Open BIM workflow, we first of all define our goals. So we define our BIM uses, and we are creating our models according to those users, right? So each of those scenarios could be aligned to those users, which means that we can create different IFC based models using different classification systems. So we will apply a different classification mapping rule to each of our IFC exports according to those different BIM uses. So in other words, what we will get is different IFC models in which same objects could be mapped as different IFC entities using different enumerations from the predefined type attribute, and of course applying different customized property sets, and also using internal ArchiCAD ones to be mapped as values for the standardized schema ones. Okay, so this is a very important core feature that you should explore, and we suggest you to go through. And also based on that, of course, when we are creating those objects and we are mapping them into some IFC entities and using a classification system as the keystone to those mappings, here I want to show you one example. Imagine that we are modeling a building, a normal building model in which there are different urban elements, and you know that urban elements are out of the building domain, and for example IFC 2x3 2x3 does not cover urban domain. So which means that if we are modeling, for example, a sidewalk, we should create a BIM classification item for the sidewalk as a urban paving, and then we would use the classification mapping rule that we can do in ArchiCAD and map those modeled elements to a class. In this case, we like to map it because it's out of the building domain as an IFC building element proxy, and then applying predefined type enumeration, user-defined, and also as the IFC schema already prescribes, defining sidewalk as the value of the attribute object type. And this could be done for any other objects that you need to go deeper when you are identifying them. And this is very, very powerful and very, very user-friendly to handle it from Graphisoft ArchiCAD. At the same time, you can also define the name attribute from the class that you are mapping your object, and you have several ways to do it at an instance level or also using some internal roles. And usually the ArchiCAD element ID is the default value of that class attribute. And then talking about other types of classes, we have the IFC Type Product, which means that you can define the type level of your geometries, the geometries that will be embedded in your models, right? In ArchiCAD, the way of creating those types is quite interesting, because you start creating your instances at the very beginning. So you are placing your objects within your model, and at the end of your modeling process is when you are defining which are the types to which those instances are referred to. So you need to use this feature called IFC Project Manager, the IFC Preview, in which you can use some mapping rules that will enable you to create the desired types. And this is a very, very powerful tool that will enable you to define in a quite accurate way the different types of your objects. Also, you will be able to define common attributes, the ones that are stored in the standardized property set of each of the IFC schema rooted classes. Which means that you will be able to define in a very user-friendly way the IsExternal property, in this case this attribute, exterior, interior, or undefined, also with the load-bearing attribute, and also with the rest of attributes within that property set. And you will be able to use that using the same mapping rules that we were using in the previous slide. And what about materials? Of course, materials is a quite, let's call it, interesting part when we are exchanging information based in IFC, especially because there are different levels of maturity exchanging information regarding materials, depending on if we are exchanging information based on in IFC 2x3 or in IFC 4. But what we want to highlight here is how to handle the material information in a quite basic level, depending on the type of tools that you are using to produce your geometries. In ArchiCAD, when you are producing slabs, beams, walls, and roofs, you create building materials, right? So each of those building materials will create the IFC material information stored within the IFC based information model. But what happens with windows, doors, and also parametric objects, which means that you will have to rename the object hatchings. You know that these beam authoring tools, and especially ArchiCAD, it's a quite specialized one in creating also to the outcomes. So, which means that it has a lot of features that are aimed to create quite high quality to the outcomes, which means that we are using several hatchings, and if you rename those hatchings in the same way you are naming your building materials, you will be able to get in your IFC based information model the IFC materials in your windows, doors, and objects. So this is a quite tough task, but we encourage you to go through this path if you really want to create high quality deliverables based in IFC from ArchiCAD. And also let's talk about the standard property sets. IFC schema is a standardized data model, right? And there's a bunch of standard property sets that most of times are underused. So in ArchiCAD, you can preview most of those property sets, the standardized ones, and you can predefine which are the values of each of those properties stored within each of those property sets, standardized ones. And you can also combine the custom internal property sets using a tool to use expressions, formulas, to create the naming conventions of each of the values that you want to map to each of those properties. This is a very, very powerful feature, and you can check all of that before exporting your IFC. So this is awesome. So we encourage you to use this IFC Project Manager and these mapping rules to achieve that. And of course, if you can do it with the standard property sets, you can also do it with your custom property sets. The ones that are required by your client, your BIM execution plan, or even your own internal company-based requirements, right? So you can define here with this feature called Property Manager different properties, and you can use the, as we mentioned, expression-based values, and you can, again, the classification keystone in ArchiCAD, we can map to the different objects, the different geometries that we have included in our model, the different property sets using the classification items as our mapping driver. Okay, this is very, very powerful. And also, what about other ways of delivering information within our IFC models? What about assignments? What about IFC group? We can create IFC groups. We can group elements according to different needs. In this case, what we are usually doing is use the name attribute from this IFC group instance, and we are applying a unique reference number. This is quite useful, especially for operations and maintenance purposes, but you can use it for any other type of purposes too. So from graphics of ArchiCAD, you can create IFC groups. And you can also create, of course, some of the special structures within the IFC schema, and one of the most granular ones are the spaces, but also grouping spaces as zones, right? So first of all, with the spaces, you can also use solid element operations to modify the shape of those spaces. And you can also even export these spaces, including the elements that are contained within those spatial structures, and also defining the space boundaries using this class IFC rel space boundary at the second level, which will enable you to make differences between the different materials within one single element, and also providing you information about the different other spaces that are at the other side of the surrounding elements. This is very, very powerful. And also creating different zones, so grouping these elements, the different IFC spaces, and you will use also that IFC preview feature called IFC Project Manager, in which you will be able to, using the drag and drop action, including here the different IFC spaces, and also enriching the data that you need, also the different property sets, that the standardized ones that belong to the IFC zone class. The same for IFC system, and this is quite powerful as well, because in ArchiCAD you can define your own standardized map systems when you are modeling facilities, and you here have a way to automatize the creation of different IFC systems using this button here, and you will take your own map systems and you will transfer them as an IFC system, and then you can also customize them, adding additional elements, additional objects using the drag and drop action here. So this is very, very user-friendly, a user-friendly feature within ArchiCAD. So I hope that all these tips and tricks are useful for your activity, especially if you are
a technician involved in the creation of IFC files from the graphics of ArchiCAD. Have a good day and